You know, the Democracy Fund, which of course is the Canada Revenue Agency charity that pursues a lot of the civil liberties cases we talk about, they have a new scholar in residence, a historian in residence, my friend Conrad Black. And exciting news, he is going to give a keynote speech on the history of Canadian civil liberties later this month. So I'll give you the details in a second. Welcome back to the show. Great to see you again.
Thank you, Ezra.
The history of Canadian civil liberties. I bet a lot of people in Canada say there is no history of civil liberties. That's an American thing.
There might well be such people, and they may be numerous, but they would not, in that case, be correct. There is such a history, and it's a distinguished history. Canada has perhaps a less well-known history in civil liberties because it hasn't been as fiercely contended. I mean, there have been incidences of abuse of power by governments, but they're rarely as violent or evidently oppressive as in countries that have, for example, a legacy of slavery, that sort of thing.
That's a great point. Now, I think most Canadians know about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that for many years was called the essential Canadian identity. Some people a little bit older might remember Diefenbaker's Bill of Rights, even though it didn't have the same constitutional status.
Well, that's the problem. You know, civil rights are essentially a provincial matter, not a federal one.
But the history of Canadian civil liberties goes back even before Canada was officially independent, right?
Yes, indeed it does.
Tell us a little bit about it. I don't want you to give away your speech, and I'm going to tell folks how they can watch that speech on June 21, but give us some ideas of the history.
Well, just to go back all the way back to the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, so, 1759, the British took over what was then Canada. It was really just Quebec, and the British already had a colony in Nova Scotia and in what was then Acadia, New Brunswick. But they took over Quebec in stages, but in the early 1760s, and then officially gained authority over it in 1763. And the governor, not the very first governor, but the first long-term governor, Sir Guy Carleton, after whom Carleton University is named. Subsequently, his name is Lord Dorchester. It's the same person. And, of course, there are Dorchester counties and streets and things in various places. Well, he saw the American Revolution coming, and he was very friendly with the French Canadians, and he liked them, and they liked him. And he saw that the only way to keep French Canada, Quebec as it now is, from gravitating towards the Americans once the revolution was launched. You could see it coming because of the impasse between the authorities of the American authorities and the British. Was to assure the French Canadians that they could keep their civil law, they could keep their religion, and they could, which was, in the English part of North America, a minority religion at that time, and they could keep the French language, and that was the great fear the French Canadians had, and they've had intermittently ever since then, of being assimilated. That all of a sudden there wouldn't be enough of them, and they wouldn't have enough jurisdiction to protect their culture. You see, so he promised them that, and on that basis, they were loyal to the British government in the American Revolutionary War and in the War of 1812.
I never thought of it that way. I always thought of that as, well, let's just come to some compromise to, a political compromise to end a war. But it wasn't just a political compromise. It was a promise of civil rights.
A promise of
protecting minority rights.
And admittedly not entirely spontaneously from a love of civil rights as such, perhaps,
but just
we're being psychologists
to
here
make
a little
peace,
bit,
to get some quiet.
Well, to try and keep Canada in the British Empire as the Americans might be departing the British Empire.
Now, I mean, the UK has been a fountain of the rule of law, and I mean, so many of our freedoms were inherited from the UK.
Yes, and so were the Americans, by the way.
Right.
Yeah.
In those early days of Canada, did Canadians look to the Americans and say they're freer down there? Or after the American Revolution, did Canadians say they are freer down there, we want some of that up here? Or did they think they're wilder down there? What did they say?
Well, they thought both, and they didn't think the second was something that they envied or wanted to emulate. But they did, and in particular, the Canadian, the native Canadian authorities are not now going past the British governors, but before Canada was independent, Baldwin and LaFontaine, and then Macdonald and Cartier and George Brown, just before Confederation, they were in the delicate position of seeking rights, in particular, elected, accountable politicians being in charge of everything except foreign policy, and which they conceded at that point was really in the hands of the British. But everything else, they didn't want a dictation from the British governor. They wanted to have their own elected officials, and as the Americans had and as the British had after the first Reform Act and in 1832. So what they were saying was, we want the same rights as the British and the Americans, the people have in each place. But they couldn't agitate too much, because if they did, the British, they feared, would make a deal with the Americans and give the Americans Canada in exchange for something else. So they had to agitate enough to get the attention of the British, but not so much that the British ruling class became exasperated with them. So you had all these people, Macdonald in particular, traipsing over to England all through the 1840s and 50s and early 60s, trying to persuade Palmerston and Disraeli and Gladstone, these British statesmen, of how to treat Canada fairly, and he ultimately was successful.
Now, you don't want to put too much, as Shakespeare said, what's in a name. Just because someone calls himself Conservative Party doesn't mean they are. No. You have oxymorons like progressive conservative. What even is that?
A merger of two parties.
Well, exactly. So you don't want to put too much meaning in a name. But the Liberal Party of Canada, a very old party, the Liberal Party, did that have a meaning in the root of that word, liberty, freedom, the Latin? That comes from the word for freedom. Did they historically see themselves as the party of freedom?
To a degree, yes. They were not a Whig party. I mean, the British Liberals, Mr. Gladstone's party, had been the Whigs, and going back to Walpole. And the American Republican Party had been the Whigs under, the only presidents they had were William H. Harrison and Zachary Taylor. But Henry Clay, for example, was a famous Whig, ran 3 times for president. But in Canada, you're quite right. The Liberal Party wasn't a successor to Whigs, which are really, in Britain, noblemen, but trying to take more rights from the king. The Liberals were they were a kind of middle class party without connections to the aristocracy, and it was founded by Mr. Blake, who was not successful, running twice in general elections against John A. Macdonald, but his great contribution to Canada was he effectively chose Laurier as a successor. But that was their program. You're right. It was liberal in the sense of liberalizing. Yes.
I mean, Laurier, I think he talked about freedom. Freedom is Canada's nationality. Freedom is who we are. I think he meant it.
Yes, sure did. Yes, certainly did.
Did he do things to promote it? Did he chide those who would be too authoritarian? What is his track record as the liberal big boss? He's still on our money. He's still hailed as the great liberal of Canadian history. What did he do for freedom?
A number of things. And he supported the secular egalitarianism of incoming provinces, Manitoba and then later Alberta and Saskatchewan, and overcame what were religious tensions at the time, even though, of course, most of his fellow French Canadians were Roman Catholics. He somewhat demoted the status of the Catholic Church in these new provinces. Secondly, I mean, not to the point of, he wasn't against religious practice, but he was drawing a clear line between secular and ecclesiastical authority. And secondly, he was quite adamant in minority rights. He famously said when a permit for the Salvation Army to stage a parade in Montreal was withheld, he insisted that be revisited, that they be given the permit. And he said, for all to hear, and it was quoted everywhere in Canada, I will lead that parade myself if necessary. to demonstrate
Wow.
that all such people have a right peaceably to.
That's a great story.
demonstrate.
I bet you 99.9% of Canadians don't know that story. For him to say, I will be the front of that protest if it's not allowed. Like that's almost impossible to imagine.
It was a very brave thing to say, and he meant it. And the other thing I would cite is, as we got closer to World War I, and the tensions in Europe between the alliance of Britain, France, and Russia, and the Germans and Austro-Hungarians, and to some degree Italy, became more tense. The British put great emphasis on imperial solidarity. They essentially wanted Canada and Australia and New Zealand and South Africa to be extensions of Britain for the purposes of providing money to, build navies and provide soldiers and so forth. And Laurier led the forces at the Empire premiers' meetings, prime ministers' meetings, of autonomy for the Dominions, and said, look, we of course we want to help Britain, but these are our decisions and not yours, and we're not surrendering that autonomy that we've earned, and that isn't directly civil liberties in the sense it's usually meant, but it was preserving the collective liberty of this country, and I would, with that qualification, put it into the category of things responding to your question.
And how about the Supreme Court? For the longest time in the United States, I don't think the Supreme Court had its power and prestige that it has now. I mean, there were people who rejected an appointment to the Supreme Court in the States. I don't think it had the prestige and glamour and power that it's given now.
I think it's fluctuated. Sometimes it did and sometimes not.
How about in Canada? I don't think we talk about our Supreme Court a lot, but it actually makes an enormous number of decisions. And I don't think it's scrutinized as much as the American system is because we don't have the confirmation hearing. But let me ask you, has it been a force for freedom, or has it been a force putting a brake on freedom?
I think in general, it has been a force for freedom. You'll keep in mind that there was an appeal beyond the Supreme Court of Canada to the British,
right.
The law lords of the British Privy Council. And that was only abolished in the late 40s. Mr. King,
right,
and a lot of pressure from Quebec in that. And by the way, Quebec wanted to retain that because they thought, Quebec historically thought the British, the legal section of the British Privy Council was a better defender of political rights of the province than the Supreme Court in Ottawa was, because it's the justices are appointed entirely by the federal government.
Right.
But I would say that in general, the Supreme Court has had a good record of defending civil rights in this country. Definitely so. And you're quite right. I mean, the U.S. Supreme Court, for example, under Roger Taney, approved the elaborate regime of chasing fugitive slaves and this kind of thing. I mean, it was really quite reactionary and reprehensible. Now, it was all part of a compromise to keep the American Union going for the last 10 years before the Civil War, but it was a shameful interpretation of the law, in the opinion of posterity.
Well, I'm excited that you are addressing this issue because I feel it's a real gap. And I think one of the reasons that the last 2 years, Canada has not fought, in my opinion, hard enough for civil liberties. There was not enough political opposition to some of the tactics of the lockdowns, that there's not enough opposition to the censorship plans of Trudeau. I feel it's because certain institutions have forgotten their freedom roots in Canada.
I think that is true, and I'd add one thing. We have to some extent been sidelined by this issue of the Native people. And I want to be clear. I think the Native people have a legitimate grievance, and we have to do better. I would state that at the outset. But the courts have become, not just the Supreme Court, but the appellate courts generally in the West, have become so preoccupied with these issues that they've focused more on that, and that has tended to diminish the rights of everybody else to some extent. And I think we've got the tail wagging the dog in some of these things.
My point about the Indian Act, as it's still called, is that it is an intolerable
Completely
restriction on very basic civil rights
Yeah.
of people on those bands. But we'll talk about that another day.
Yeah.
I want to look into the camera and say to folks that Conrad Black is the historian in residence at the Democracy Fund with a focus on the history of Canadian civil liberties. And he is giving a keynote speech on this subject Tuesday, June 21st at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, if you're in Toronto, you want to be there. It's at the Carlu, which is a gorgeous building on Yonge Street, easy to find. But if you're not in the Toronto area, you can still watch it by Zoom. So I don't care where you are around the world, you can join in. It's $11 for an online ticket, $22 to be there in person. There's also a VIP ticket if you want to come for wine and cheese. And there's even a small dinner afterwards if you want to follow up on the speech with Conrad Black directly. Go to thedemocracyfund.ca. We'll put a link under this video too. I think it's going to be a great event. Dr. Julie Ponesse is going to be there. I'll be there, of course. We've already sent out some emails inviting folks. Basically, you're going to give a keynote speech on this subject and take questions, right?
Yes.
I think it's going to be great. So go to thedemocracyfund.ca. That date again, Tuesday, June 21st. You can be there in person or online. Thanks very much for coming in today.
Thank you, Ezra.
There you have it. Stay with us. Your letters to me are next. That was an excerpt from my daily TV-style show called The Ezra Levant Show. Each weekday, I do a monologue on the news of the day. Then I interview a fascinating guest. I read some fan mail or hate mail, depends on which I like more. And we end with a video of the day. You can get it all at rebelnewsplus.com.